So our first speaker today is Tabea Lakemann. I'm not sure I pronounced that right. She is a research fellow at the GIGA Institute of African Affairs in Hamburg in Germany. And she's currently pursuing her PhD at the University of Göttingen on the dynamics of micro and small enterprises in developing countries. And I think she might talk about her field research actually today in Kampala in Uganda. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Tabea.
Thank you very much, Anastasia. Thank you for inviting me and for the kind introduction. Today, I will be talking about services, informality, and productivity in Africa. I'm not seeing the slides yet. Lucretia, can you please show my slides?
And actually, while we're waiting for that, I would encourage all our participants, if you have any questions in WebEx, you can start typing them in the chat box. But when you do so, please make sure that you're sending the chat to everyone, not just to the speaker or one host. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Lucretia. Now we can see my slides. This is actually mainly descriptive work, which is not based on my field research in Uganda. It is based on a blog entry that we did for the OECD. This talk has an employment focus. So first of all, I'll be talking about how many jobs will be needed on the African continent over the coming decades. Then I'll take a historical perspective on employment growth patterns in different sectors in sub-Saharan Africa. And then I will briefly talk about services and informality. So could we move? Yes. So first of all, jumping straight into the topic of decent and productive employment, let me remind everyone of SDG number 8, which is to promote sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. Now, looking at how many people we have on the African continent right now, about 718 million people are of working age population out of almost 1.3 billion people on the African continent in total. And until 2030, we expect to have about 1.7 billion people on the African continent and almost 1 billion people of working age. So approximately an additional 200 million jobs, or even more than that, will be needed until then. Now, looking at those 718 million that are of working age right now, I'm going to show you their status in employment, which is an indicator by the International Labour Organization, which is also closely related to informality. So the International Labour Organization differentiates between being an employee, an employer, an own account worker, or a contributing family worker. And own account workers and contributing family workers, which you can see in orange and yellow here, are classified as being in vulnerable employment. This is because their profits or their incomes depend directly on the profits of their businesses, but also because they have a lack of social protection and everything that is associated with decent employment. So this is the situation right now, and we can see that basically a lot of decent jobs are needed. In addition, 264 million people are not even in employment right now. Now, looking at where we have seen employment growth in the past decades, can we move to the next slide, please? This is basically what we see here is a story of structural change. So in all countries that I'll talk about in a second, we have seen a decline in agriculture, no significant growth in industry and manufacturing, but growth in services. And here I'm showing you 11 different countries from the Africa Sector database. And I've tried to classify them a little bit according to the patterns that we observe. So on the left, we see Botswana, Mauritius, and South Africa, which are also the richest countries in this group. And here we see a considerable decline in agriculture, employment share of services, which is about half, and also some industry and manufacturing. Then in a second group of countries, which is Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal, we also see a decline in agriculture, but it has not progressed as far yet. We also see a rise in services, and we see that the employment share of industry and manufacturing is very small. And then a third group of countries still has very high employment shares in agriculture. In Zambia, the last country, we even see that the employment share of agriculture has risen. So overall, this trend has been called premature deindustrialization, or also, of course, a strong employment growth in services. Now, you're probably wondering which services sectors are accounting for this employment growth. And moving on to the next slide, we look at the same the same countries, but which subsectors drive employment growth in services. And here we see that in the first group of countries, the richest countries, Botswana, Mauritius, and South Africa, the services sectors are relatively well diversified. We have different types of services. We even have some business services, which are probably the most advanced services. But in a second group of countries, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, and Senegal, this strong growth in employment and services has been driven mainly by trade services. And to some extent, in government services, employment has been relatively stable. And then in Ethiopia, Malawi, and Tanzania, the services sectors are still quite small, although we do see some growth recently. Unfortunately, we don't have data for Zambia here. Now, in the beginning, I also talked about productive employment, of course, because productivity is strongly linked to the earnings you can derive from a job. Let's look at productivity differentials in these sectors, which is on the next slide. So here we see labor productivity in services and some industry sectors, comparing South Africa and Ghana as examples. So on top are industry sectors, and below we see services. Both are benchmarked against the productivity being value added per worker in the whole economy. And what we see in both countries, although the order of subsectors is a little different, that personal services and trade services are by far the least productive categories of services. And putting this together with what I showed you before, that growth in services was mainly driven by trade services, we can deduce that basically we have seen a growth in low productivity services. Now, moving on to the next slide, how is growth in services linked to informality? First of all, when we talk about informality, what do we mean by informality? There are, of course, different ways of defining it, or different views. One is the informal employment view. One is the view of informal firms. And both are not necessarily the same. So, for example, I could be in informal employment, meaning I do not have a work contract, even though the firm that I work in is formal. Having said that, there's unfortunately hardly any systematic data, meaning that we have cross-country data sets on both of these types of informality, which is of course closely related to the fact that if you have an informal firm, you prefer to hide and not talk about your informality. Another thing that we need to keep in mind is the heterogeneity of the services sector, which you have seen in the productivity differentials before. There's anecdotal evidence of a high overlap between informal employment and low productivity services like trade services or personal services. But also the more recent growth of high productivity services that you have seen in countries like South Africa will be mostly formal, but we don't observe that in all countries yet. Now, looking at the data, moving on to the next slide, please. Looking at the data, I've showed you this status and employment indicator for the whole of Africa before, and here it is disaggregated for these 11 countries. So as I said before, own account work and contributing family work, the orange and yellow categories are closely linked to informal employment. And here we see a similar picture as before. Botswana, Mauritius, and South Africa have very low shares of this type of vulnerable employment, whereas the picture is much more diverse in all the other countries. And on the right, I have added an estimate of how much the informal sector contributes to GDP. And that is roughly in line, but of course it is not necessarily the same. So Botswana, Mauritius, and South Africa have low contributions of the informal sector to GDP between 20 and 30%, whereas it ranges from 30 to 40% in the case of Ghana to 60 to 70% even in the case of Nigeria. Another thing that I would like you to keep in mind when thinking about the informal sector, next slide please, is that it is also a source for very productive firms. So when we look at today's informal firms and how many of them started off as informal, we see the following picture. So in Uganda or Nigeria, for example, around 40% of today's formal and productive firms actually started off as informal, which means that there seems to be quite some potential in the informal sector. Of course, we need to keep in mind here that these differences between countries aren't necessarily linked to structural features of these economies, but also formalization policies. So just a brief recap of what I've just showed you. Next slide, please. I've showed you 3 groups of countries. The first one being upper middle income, having a low share of agriculture, some industry, and employment dominated by services, a relatively well-diversified services sector, and a low share of the informal economy and GDP. The second group is mostly lower middle income, has a share of agriculture and employment that is approximately half, services 1/3 to half. But the services sector is dominated by low productivity trade services. And the share of the informal economy in GDP ranges from 30 to 70%. And the third group is mostly low income. Employment is still dominated by agriculture, and the services sector is dominated by trade services, and also very different shares of the informal economy in GDP. So moving on to the next slide, what is the way forward? So in a nutshell, hundreds of millions of jobs will be needed on the African continent over the coming decades, but we can't necessarily count on industry to provide these jobs. What we have seen in the past is that employment growth is in services, often, but not exclusively, of course, in low productivity ones, and also often in informal employment. So the policy lessons that we can draw from this is that we need to look at ways to increase productivity in the services sector. This could be by identifying country-specific subsectors that have very high potential. And another note is that from an employment perspective, it is important to ease the way into formality, to not punish the vulnerable for being vulnerable by making it too hard to formalize, because that means a lot of people will not have social protection ultimately. So this is it from my side. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Tabea. Just another quick check-in. If there's anyone who just called in over the phone and you don't have the slides yet, please unmute yourself and identify yourself, and our DCED colleagues can email you the slides. And with that, I would also just like to open it up for a quick few minutes for any questions for Tabea. You can ask that sort of over the audio over the phone if you unmute yourself, or you can enter into the chat box on WebEx by sending a chat to everyone. And actually, our host has unmuted everyone, so if you want to speak up now, you can do that. And maybe while we're waiting, I would like to start with one of the questions that we got from our registered participants, which is basically, is it possible to formalize the informal sector, or they're going to stay informal, or are there good examples of countries that have helped informal SMEs to formalize to their benefit? That's a great question. Tabea, do you want to start with that one? In the meantime, we can welcome more questions as well.
Yes. Well, to be honest, I think I may not be the right person to ask about formalization policies and best practices, but I think we may even have some people in the audience who would be knowledgeable on that, because we do have quite a few practitioners, right?
Certainly, I think maybe what we can do is table this question for sort of the larger conversation after our second presentation. But in the meantime, I see a question from Sylvia SSR, which I was actually wondering myself. Could you please define trade services?
Yes. So trade services is basically, sorry, I was just using the term without clarifying it. So trade services is basically the category of retail and wholesale trade, everything that we associate with trading. So an example of an informal business in the trade services sector would be a retail shop or a hawker or something like that.
Great. And actually, I guess, Tabea, since you probably saw, and you may see Sylvia's follow-up question, so it does not refer to international trade necessarily.
No. And now I see another question, which is, should we focus on improving the productivity of personal and trade services specifically, or the services sector more broadly? That's an excellent question, which I think needs to be answered at the country level. Oh, thank you.
Tabea, actually, could you elaborate a little bit more when you say that's sort of how much should we focus and target on specific services at the country level? Could you elaborate on why you think that's the case?
Well, that is actually closely related to newer developments, which were not yet mirrored in the presentation. But of course, for example, in a country like Kenya, we have also seen the Silicon Savannah type of developments. So very new kinds of services that are probably highly productive and that could be highly suitable to that specific environment, whereas in other places that might simply not be possible.
Fantastic, and actually I think that's closely related to Bridget's question, which I'll sort of read aloud. With regard to your policy recommendation, making the service sector more productive, usually the service sector is entered because of low costs and low skills, so it's quite crowded. So there's kind of a race to the bottom. Wouldn't it be better to create alternatives instead?
I think that's one of the key questions of today's webinar, in fact. Should we try to eradicate the informal sector, so to say, or should we try to improve it? And I would probably say both, because I don't think we can provide enough alternatives to basically keep people away from entering this low productivity services sector altogether. So the strategy should be to both improve productivity but also create alternatives so that we don't have this kind of necessity entrepreneurship to the same extent.
That's great, that's great. And just to let everyone on the phone know, a colleague from Anna Marie from the ILO just shared in the chat box a link for their latest data on the informal economy, and I guess hopefully that's part of the recording that you all can access after this webinar. Now I just want to give a quick last chance for anyone on the phone. Do you want to ask any questions?
Hello, this is Anna Marie.
Oh, hi.
Hi, I just wanted to contribute a little bit on informality and whether or not we should actually look for alternatives rather than improve maybe productivity in the sector. I think if you look at the different data from different countries, you realize that even the definition of informality itself differs from one area to another. So even as we think about what we need to do with the sector, we need to take into account some of these contexts in which we actually discuss informal economy. So for some, you will find that it's just a legal term to say formal and informal. Maybe they're just not registered, or maybe they do not pay taxes, or maybe it is the very low productivity. So it depends on what we are looking at. But since we are looking at the economic units here, of course, productivity is very important. And we at the ILO, we actually recommend to improve the working conditions in the informal economy, and of course productivity is part of it. And we believe that by doing that, when the informal economy units or enterprises in this case then are able to increase earnings, then they might be motivated to be formalized based on the context within which they're working. So we also try and look at both areas there. But I also wanted to point out that when I think at the beginning of Tabea's presentation, she was showing us data where we looked at employers, employees, own account workers, and all that. In the ILO definition, all these are also can be part and parcel of the informal economy. We do have employers in the informal economy. We do have employees in the informal economy. And then the own account workers, of course, are the ones that are directly linked to the informal economy. But we do have all these dynamics there. So again, when we look at the sector, it's really, it might be useful also to talk about who are we really targeting. If we are talking about workers, we're really looking at making sure they're protected. You know, we're talking about decent work. We talked about social protection and all that. If you're looking at employers, again, we have to figure out what it is that employers can actually do to improve their work in the informal economy. And then, of course, as enterprises, which is where many countries are focused, because, again, there are other legal frameworks that are actually coordinate or oversee how enterprises work. So we kind of have all these different dynamics that we usually take into account, and I think going forward, we need to not ask very simply whether or not we should just look for alternatives or improve the informal economy, but really try to understand what dynamics are we really talking about in the informal economy and which ones do we want to focus in first. I just wanted to contribute that.
Thank you very much, Anna Marie. And then we also have a comment from, I guess, our colleague JV from the ILO, also emphasizing that increasing productivity is important but not sufficient to foster formalization of enterprises. And it is, this is from Judith, it is very important to put in place incentives to formalize. My question is whether you gathered any information on suitable incentives and our policies that have been effective to formalize enterprises. I don't know, Tabea, do you want to take that?
Hi.
I can do it.
Hi. This is
Yes.
Tabea from Sweden, from CIDA. Can I add something?
Could you hold on until we've addressed Judith's question?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, I think we may actually want to take that later, or if you have something to say on it, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll just answer this super quickly, actually. But we can follow up on it more later on. This is Anastasia. I think a lot of the policies that at least donors such as USAID and the World Bank have tried, such as reducing the cost to formalize or making it easier for basically informal firms to formalize, such as, you know, they have to have one-stop shop or whatever for registration. We've found that it basically has no effect on formalization rates. But often we do these in isolation, so there may be other attempts out there, and we can talk more later on. And then I think our colleague's trying to speak up, so please go ahead.
Yeah. Now, I don't have much to add, except that just as Anna Marie had already said what I had to say, and I think the question of formalizing or not formalizing informal economy is very much for me or for us in CIDA is a question to what extent the formal economy can respond to the requirements of the needs of the actors, whether the employers, employees, owner of workers, to their needs. If as long as the formal sector and the formal policy framework in the particular country is concerned are not able to respond for the inclusion of the informal actors in the broader formal economy, I think that problem will remain with us. And I understand very much that this is a gigantic task, because today, in fact, the informal economy is growing on the one hand because of its own dynamism, but on the other hand because of the incapacity of the formal sector to absorb and create more jobs for them. So I mean, if one would refer to the ILO recommendation on the transition from informal to formal, I think that's a good point of reference, which contains, in fact, all the questions which you are talking here. I think that recommendation provides a lot of broad guidance and advice of how governments or other stakeholders can eventually try to address these issues at the different contexts. Thanks. This is Kavi from Sweden.
Thank you very much. With that, I'd like to move on to our second speaker, because I think we're starting to discuss a lot of related questions. So I'm glad also to introduce Will Nielsen, who is a consultant with the World Bank. He's been working with the bank on informality, public procurement policies to prefer certain types of firms, business entry reform, as we've been discussing, and policies to support inclusive business. Will has a Master of Public Administration from Cornell. And with that, I will hand it over to Will.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Anastasia, for the introduction, and thank you, Tabea, for that excellent presentation. Yeah, the discussion we just had in the middle there is actually a great lead into what I'm going to talk about as well, and that's just this idea of rethinking informality and how we go about it, how we approach it, and what that means for future interventions and policy reforms. So I'll jump to the next slide. And this is just the problem, which I know many of you are probably familiar with, and that's just, in many cases, the general scale of the informal sector and how its complexity with the wide variety of firms that are a part of it, as well as that, you know, in some cases this informal sector may be growing, and depending on the player within the sector, aspects of this informality can be a good thing at times. But so overall, this current approach, it hasn't led to the desired reductions in rates of informality, and we still just have partial understanding of how best to address it, given its extensive nature, and many of the interventions that have been put in place have been relatively expensive and maybe have limited external validity in terms of their findings. But so because many of these interventions often are geared towards this business environment and business entry reform, one of these takeaways that I think both Ana Maria and Anastasia mentioned is that this ease of formalization is not necessarily a case for formalization itself. And so there's aspects of making clear the benefits that are important as well. Sorry, was the slide able to switch? There we go. So given this situation, we decided to kind of take a step back and think more about this mental model that we're currently framing informal work with. And so if these interventions that are based on this mental model have only been kind of moderately effective, maybe there's a chance that we should be looking at expanding this mental model. But so to take a quick step back, these current views and current approaches that we've been taking right now, there's leading views based on exit, exclusion, and dual economy, as well as also a legalist, structuralist, and dualist approaches that are very similar. But these generally look at you know, businesses are exiting the formal economy out of choice, or businesses are being excluded from the formal economy, or there's just not enough formal jobs to absorb all the different potential workers, and so we end up with this dual economy view. But so based on these viewpoints, then the underlying causes that we often look to are a lack of development or bad governance. But so with this idea of looking at expanding our idea of informality and how we can best approach it, we came to this idea of rethinking, and that takes me to the next slide then. And as we think about this model of all the various influences that are impacting the informal firm, it can be very wide-reaching, much more so than just the cost of registration. And so we began to think more about if there's certain links or certain points of influence that we currently have not studied to the extent necessary, or may even be absent from many of the studies that have been put into place at this point. And so we came up with a series of questions. Several of them are listed here, and there's many, many more I'm sure we could add, and I'm sure you all have many that you could add as well. But so in general, it's questions along the lines of thinking about how well do we know these initial conditions of the system that the informal firm or informal workers are currently experiencing, and if there's relationships we're not really recognizing or giving due process to. So from there, I'll jump to the next slide, and this is just a representation to go along with all these different questions that we come up with. So there's just a vast variety of variables that are going to impact a firm's perception of the costs and benefits of formality. And I'm sure there's many more we could add onto this as well, but each of those will impact the legal, fiscal, and labor forms of formalization. But important to note as well then is that many of these variables are impacting each other, of course. They're not just targeting the formalization itself. And so in some cases it may be more worthwhile to be focusing on the relationship between the different variables and have the formalization be more of a side effect from policy reform. And of course, in many cases, this is what is already done, although we may not be giving as much of a lens or as much consideration to the side effect of formality. Moving to the next slide. So based on this system with the wide-ranging variables, we identified a few initial areas of points of study that we think would be good to look into in more detail, and some of them have already begun to be addressed in more detail as well. But so with these points of study, then we'd like to be able to add them on to these existing evidence bases that have already been developed as a way to sort of round out our view of all the different influences on a firm. So the first one, and this was one I know that was brought up during the questions as well, was just this increased recognition of firm differentiation. And several studies recently have begun to develop that, but I think we're interested in pursuing that to even greater depth with a more just differentiated set of characteristics that we can use to define the different types of firms and different types of workers within the space. And with that idea, then, of course, we'd like to get to a point where we can start conducting more of apples-to-apples comparisons of interventions or policy changes between different geographies, so we can align or better understand the changes that occur for a given set of firms with a given set of characteristics beyond just being a part of the informal sector. But so then from there, I'll quickly run through these next few. The next one then is giving a little more study and interest to the understanding of how clusters and clustering impacts informal firms, given that there's a wide variety of studies that have been done looking at clustering and the types of benefits that can be created and whether the clusters develop organically or whether they're fostered through policy reform. But then with that, there's also inherently a variety of formal and informal linkages that occur. And so I think we're interested in seeing how, if informal firms are integrated, at least in part, into a partially formal cluster, how does that change the informal firm's perception of formality or the perception of benefits that could accrue if they went with a formal route. On the next slide then is just a few more potential routes of study that I think we're very interested in and have begun to be developed a little more as well. One of these is the study of these intermediate legal forms. There's an ongoing study right now. Maybe many of you are familiar with in Benin, but it's an intermediate legal status, the entrepreneurial status that is implemented in several countries in Africa right now, and is based on this idea of just how can we reduce the cost to access benefits. Right now, just from the initial results, I know the results have been fairly mixed in terms of while firms may adopt this legal status, they're not necessarily taking advantage of the types of benefits that we would typically assume they would want to take advantage of. The next one then is just more targeted informal sector support that may not necessarily be targeting formalization itself, and that's just as a method to help better understand types of needs that informal firms or informal workers might need that we can and then approach the aspect of formalization kind of indirectly. And then the last one here that I'll mention, and I think would be definitely very interesting, and certainly with the prominence of behavioral economics today, there's a lot of interest around the subject as well, and that's just understanding the types of business norms and business traditions that are in place in a given context, rules of thumbs that are often in place, but also as well as perception of government, tax morale. Many of these factors can be kind of hidden markers within a firm's decision-making process for whether formality is worth pursuing. From there, I'll jump to the next slide, This is just to give an idea of some of these initial thoughts, so I wouldn't look too closely at any of these charts or anything, but basically just to show how we've been thinking about, like in the upper right hand with the blue table, is a variety of characteristics that can define informality, as well as the many different kind of qualities and subjects that accrue or are relevant to those different firms. On the bottom, then you see a variety of characteristics that are accompanying the given studies, and that's just so we start to break down the existing evidence base by the variables that were impacted via the study, as well as the variables that were changed as a part of the intervention. And then the kind of colorful diagram in the back is just to give an idea of the percentage of behavior change that has been noted in some studies, but this really paints a very rosy picture, because many of these numbers that I included in that chart there are just to show the maximum amount of behavior change, but it doesn't take into account the almost certain high-level drop-off rates that tend to occur with these types of interventions, as well as that it's not necessarily saying that this certain percentage of firms all achieve full formalization, but only that a certain percentage of firms were became licensed within their municipality, but still in many cases may not register with the tax authority or pay taxes. So I'll move on to the last slide then, just a quick summary. So as many of you know then, that there's obviously this ongoing discussion regarding the informality, and we've been approaching it with a mindset of rethinking how to go about it, given that the solution is going to be often firm-specific and context-specific, as the variety of influences that influence a firm will be constantly changing. And so with that in mind, we're interested in kind of building out the interactions within that systems model and all the different variables that are important. And to do that, I think our first step is further development of the firm differentiation, and then taking that understanding of the wide variety of firms and the specific characteristics of those firms, we can start applying that to some of these points of study that I noted here, but also there's many more I think we could do going forward as well. So with that, I'll wrap up. I thank you all for listening, and I hope it was at least somewhat interesting, but feel free to send me questions.
Thank you very much, Will. That was super interesting, and I have a bunch of questions already, but I want to first give our participants a chance. So if you're in WebEx, you can chat to everyone, and then that way Will can see your question as well. And if you're only on the phone, then please unmute yourself, and you can please speak up for questions. Folks are still typing. I'm going to take my moderating privilege and ask the first question. Could you speak a bit more about the behavioral insights and the type of decision-making process that maybe was surprising to you and your colleagues at the World Bank that entrepreneurs are undertaking that you really didn't expect to see?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the area could definitely, well, is certainly deserving of a little more attention, and that's why I mentioned it here. But also, so one aspect or one study that we're interested in is doing a willingness to pay for benefits of formalization. And so that would work with the informal firms or informal entrepreneurs themselves and gauge, well, it both gauges their understanding of the types of benefits that exist, and then how they value those benefits, irregardless of the costs needed to gain those benefits. And so that is one aspect I know that we're interested in, just gaining that understanding. But I think part of the interest in this also is just because so many of the interventions done to date have seen such small changes in the rates of formalization. I mean, oftentimes it's like maybe 5% or 10% increases, and that may be followed by a drop-off rate, that clearly there's many other variables going on that are not being accounted for in these types of interventions. And so I think that's why this aspect of behavior and specific context has become so interesting. I hope that was partially addressing your question.
Yes, that's great. And then I think let's start with, we have some questions coming in through the chat. Let's start with in order. So question from Bridget. Could you speak a bit more about cluster and cluster analysis?
Sure. Yeah. So there's that in itself is a pretty big subject, I know, and I kind of breezed over it very quickly. But so I know the few studies that have been done currently often look at a more formalized cluster setup, such as a business association, which can have many dozens or hundreds of often informal firms involved, and oftentimes that can be a great tool for transferring of information and behavior imitation, as well as firms see certain actions or technology adoptions or benefits accruing to their neighboring firm, then they also take that similar route. So yeah, I guess I could go on for a little while about clusters if there's something, but if there's something specific within that area, I could focus in a little more on that too.
I mean, for my part, I was interested in, within the cluster topic, are you trying to look at different competitive relationships among the firms?
That can definitely be a part of it, yeah. So I think that's one of the aspects of clusters that I think are so interesting, and why we would like to pursue that more, is there's that dual nature of both competition and cooperation within the sector. So especially given the clusters, sometimes it's many firms imitating each other and essentially producing very much similar products. But then there's also clusters where they could all be complementing each other and providing a different service, but all needed by each other. I know in some cases there could be a large formal firm that has a demand for a variety of smaller machines or implements that then the informal sector can then specialize itself, and they each provide a small implement to this large formal firm. So I know there's a variety of different ways you can come at that, but that balance of cooperation and competition. And then if we start to look at the policy side of things, it becomes this kind of cooperative game between the individual firm, informal firm, their neighboring firms, as well as the outcome that government is hoping to foster by interacting with them.
Right. And then I think maybe the next question is from Anna Marie. Have you considered the impact of the size of firms? Actually, she has a second question. Since formalization is often incremental, how do you ensure formalization in the firms you work with?
Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly ensuring formalization, I think, is difficult, and I think if we had that answer, I think that's one of the answers that we're all shooting for, I guess. And unfortunately, I don't think I have a great response in regards to that, but certainly one of the ways that I know has been receiving more attention is with this aspect of firm differentiation. There's certain ones that display many characteristics that are most likely to take on a formal path, and so those are the ones that then become most deserving of the intervention and perhaps public or donor spending, whereas many others simply don't have the potential to either pursue formalization, or they're not even really interested in pursuing formalization, in which case the intervention spending often goes, it's kind of lost money at that point.
Great, and maybe at this point I'm going to pose the question from Judith to both of our speakers. Some studies indicate that it is easier to formalize startup firms than formalizing those that are already operational. Have you gathered any information on this? And looking at the time, I'm also going to give you this chance if you want to sort of add any closing remarks based on all of this discussion. Please also chime in. Maybe we'll start with Will, and then we can go to Tabea.
Sure. Yeah, it's not something I've specifically gathered information on, but many of the studies are geared towards focusing on firms that already exist and then kind of nudging them along this path of formalization, especially if they bear the characteristics that most align with a formal path. But I can also pass that to Tabea, and given her chart that I think matched with this question.
Well, actually, unfortunately, we haven't collected any information on that. My closing remark would be that I learned a lot today from everyone, so thanks for all the comments. This was a great webinar. Thank you very much.
Great. I think, and Will, did you have any other closing comments?
No, I guess, yeah, thank you very much for the webinar. I hope it was interesting, and I definitely learned a lot as well. And thanks everyone for the questions and feedback, and of course open to more questions too if there's that communication channel going forward.
So this is really great. I think we all still have remaining questions, but we found that we all have similar questions that we're grappling, and two big ones that I picked out were, one, what do we know about different interventions and policies that may actually not explicitly target formalization, but basically are trying to increase firm productivity or helping them grow. We need to try to draw those causal linkages across a longer chain and see if that actually may have a bigger impact on formality, and knowing that formality is a spectrum and change is incremental, to maybe think more about what aspect of formality do we really care about, and do we really need the entire spectrum. And the second question is, we really need to do a better job of understanding the relationship and decision-making process of different types of firms, whether that's age or size or something else. I noticed we couldn't even talk about the gender of the owner, for example, and thinking about how that may make different interventions work better for different types of firms. So I think that's a good segue to our sort of end of event survey for Anna Marie's asking, is it really a blessing or a curse? I think we'll say it depends. It depends on the type of firm and the country that we're talking about, which seems to be the answer for all of our questions. But I think this is a conversation that we need to continue for sure. So please, I think Lucretia is about to post the link to right there, the SurveyMonkey link, so that if you all could please let us know what you thought about this webinar, but also we are planning to have another webinar hopefully in December and certainly next year. So please let us know what topics you're really interested in discussing, maybe spending a whole hour on through that survey. And I think for phone participants, you'll also get the link via email. And that will really help us plan future conversations that are interesting to you. And with that, I'll just thank everyone for their participation, especially from our speakers. Thank you.